The Wright brothers' first flight in 1903 covered 120 feet. The wingspan of a Boeing 747 is 195 feet. The aircraft that eventually ruled the long-haul sky was literally wider than humanity's first moment in it. Tonight is the story of how that happened, from a fishing lodge conversation to the last delivery on a January morning in 2023. Before we continue, just wanted to let you know that we have heard your feedback and we're now on Spotify. Go through the link in the description to join us there for a rich listening experience. Stand at a large airport gate window on a busy afternoon, and if the aircraft taxiing slowly toward the runway happens to be a Boeing 747, you will feel something specific that is difficult to name, but easy to recognize once you know to look for it. It is not excitement, exactly, and it is not alarm. It is the particular quality of wrongness that comes from watching something too large to make sense, to do something that shouldn't be possible, which is to say, move. The 747's tail stands approximately 63 feet tall. That is the height of a 6-story building, and it is useful to sit with that number for a moment, rather than letting it pass like a statistic. A 6-story building does not taxi. A 6-story building does not approach a runway, gather speed, and lift into the sky with 335 people inside it. And yet, for more than 50 years, on runways at every major airport on Earth, that is exactly what happened, on average, dozens of times a day. The fuselage of a 747-100 is 231 feet long. Its wingspan is 195 feet. Its 4 engines, mounted under the wings in their distinctive pods, are each large enough that a person of average height can stand upright inside the intake of the fan housing without ducking. The aircraft weighs, at maximum takeoff weight, around 735,000 pounds. If you stood in the footprint of a 747 on the ground and looked up, you would be looking at an area covering roughly 1/3 of an acre of wing and fuselage above your head. None of this should be able to leave the ground. This is the first thing the 747 teaches anyone who thinks carefully about it, that there is a persistent gap between what the human mind considers plausible and what the human mind, working carefully over a number of years with very good mathematics, can actually build and put into the sky. The aircraft earned a nickname almost immediately after entering service in 1970, and the nickname stuck for the next 5 decades. The Queen of the Skies. Not the king, the queen, which is a word that implies something both regal and enduring, a presence that outlasts the arrangements around it, that is there when you arrive, and still there when conditions have changed and everything else has been replaced. The 747 was in commercial service for 53 years. Most of the aircraft originally designed to replace it were retired before it was. There are facts about the 747 that are straightforward engineering. The number of drawings required to design it, the length of electrical wiring running through a single aircraft, the altitude its tail can be seen from across a tarmac. And there are facts about it that are something else, that belong to the category of things that happened because this particular machine existed and not for any other reason, including 2 babies born at altitude over Africa in a single flight, a space shuttle on its back crossing California at low altitude, a president of the United States making a phone call from a seat in a configuration of rooms and equipment that would have been at home in a government building, and a final delivery in 2023 that carried a photograph of the man who designed it, with 2 words printed beside his face, "Forever incredible." Tonight traces the full arc. It begins with a conversation between 2 men whose names were Juan Trippe and Bill Allen in 1965, who between them committed their companies to building something that had never existed before, and for which no factory currently large enough to contain it was yet standing. It moves through the design challenges that the aircraft's size imposed, the engineering solutions that produced not just the 747, but every wide-body aircraft that has flown since. The first flight on a February morning in 1969, the inaugural service that departed 6 hours late and changed the economics of international travel for a generation. The lounges, and the spiral staircases, and the piano bars, and the roast beef carved at 35,000 feet. It continues through the aircraft's long middle life. As cargo carrier, as presidential transport, as shuttle ferry, as airborne telescope, as vessel for one of the most audacious humanitarian airlifts in the history of aviation. And it ends at Payne Field in Everett, Washington, on January 31st, 2023, where the same airfield that saw the first 747 take flight in 1969 received the last one off the production line, 1,574 aircraft later, with the face of Joe Sutter on its fuselage and a word beside it that said everything worth saying about 54 years of the most remarkable commercial aircraft ever built. If tonight finds you settling in for something slow and steady, this is the right place to be. There are 19 chapters left, none of them in any hurry, each one quieter than the last. The Queen will carry you all the way to the end. In 1965, the aviation industry assumed the future belonged to speed. Supersonic jets were in development across Europe and the United States, and the prevailing wisdom held that the large subsonic aircraft was effectively a transitional form, something to be tolerated until something faster arrived to replace it. Why build something enormous when you could build something fast? Juan Trippe did not agree with the prevailing wisdom. Trippe was the founder and president of Pan American World Airways, which in the mid-1960s was the largest international airline in the world and the most influential. He had spent his entire career betting on scale before speed, and his record suggested he was right about this kind of thing more reliably than the people around him. He had ordered the Boeing 707 before most airlines believed the jet age was inevitable. He had opened transatlantic service to middle-class Americans when his competitors were still treating the Atlantic as a luxury proposition. His instinct, developed over 4 decades of running an airline, was that the aircraft carrying the most people for the least cost per seat would win the long game of commercial aviation, and that no aircraft yet built had taken that principle as seriously as it deserved. In early 1965, Trippe approached Bill Allen, the president of Boeing, with a request. He wanted a new aircraft roughly 2.5 times the size of the 707, capable of reducing per-seat costs by 30%. He was not asking for a feasibility study. He was asking for a commitment, and he was offering a commitment in return. The exchange that has entered aviation history is brief and specific. Trippe reportedly said, "If you'll build it, I'll buy it." Allen responded, "If you buy it, I'll build it." This exchange, delivered during a meeting at a fishing lodge in the Pacific Northwest, committed both companies to something neither was yet certain it could accomplish. Boeing had no design for an aircraft of this size. Pan Am had no guarantee one could be built at the required price point. What both men had was the mutual conviction that if it was possible at all, they were the two organizations most capable of making it happen, and that waiting for certainty before acting was the slower path to being wrong. The formal announcement of Pan Am's order came on April 13, 1966. Pan Am committed to 25 Boeing 747-100 aircraft at a total contract value of $550 million, the largest single commercial aviation order ever placed. The confidence this generated in the broader market was immediate. Within less than a year of the start of design work, Boeing had secured 88 orders from 11 different airlines. By September 1968, before a single prototype had flown, the order book had grown to 158 aircraft from 27 airlines across multiple continents. This pace was unusual in aviation, where new aircraft typically accumulate orders cautiously after the type has proven itself in service and its real-world performance can be compared against the manufacturer's projections. The speed with which the 747 gathered orders before its first flight reflected several forces operating simultaneously. The rapid growth in international air traffic through the mid-1960s, the genuine desire of airlines to offer passengers something new on long-haul routes, and the specific economics of an aircraft that could carry more people per flight than anything in the sky, reducing cost per seat to levels that could create new markets rather than simply serving existing ones. There was also something less quantifiable at work. Tripp had a particular skill for making other airline executives feel they were either leading a revolution or being left behind by one, and his willingness to commit $550 million to an aircraft that had not yet been built sent a clear message to every carrier operating transatlantic and trans-Pacific routes. If Pan Am was going to have this aircraft, the choice was to have it to or to be seen at every major international hub as offering something demonstrably inferior to the world's most prestigious airline. What none of the order forms could specify was exactly what Boeing was going to build. The deal was signed, the money was committed. The engineering decisions that would define not just this aircraft, but the entire next generation of wide-body aviation had not yet been made. The factory capable of housing an aircraft of this size did not exist. Neither did a complete design. All of that work fell to a single engineer who had been working on something else entirely when the call came. His name was Joe Sutter, and Boeing's management pulled him off the 737 development program in 1965 to lead the 747 design team, handing him both the largest commission in commercial aviation history and a question that no one yet knew the answer to. What, exactly, was the shape of the thing Tripp and Allen had agreed to build? What Sutter designed next would change not only the form of the 747, but the form of every large commercial aircraft built anywhere in the world for the half-century that followed. Joe Sutter was born in Seattle in 1921, the son of Slovenian immigrants, and grew up in the shadow of Boeing's early manufacturing plants, with the particular advantage of living in exactly the right city at exactly the right moment in the history of aviation. He joined Boeing in 1945 after graduating from the University of Washington with a degree in aeronautical engineering and serving in the Navy, and spent the next 20 years working on the 707, the 727, and finally, the 737, the narrow-body jet that would become the best-selling commercial aircraft in history. When his management pulled him off the 737 program in 1965 to lead the 747 design team, he became responsible, in a very short period of time, for the two most successful commercial aircraft ever built, a record no other individual holds. What Sutter inherited, along with the assignment, was a specific brief and a specific problem. Tripp's original vision for the new aircraft was a full double-decker, 2 complete passenger decks running the entire length of the fuselage, one above the other, stacked like floors in a building, carrying passengers on both levels from nose to tail. It was a logical interpretation of the request for an aircraft 2.5 times the size of the 707, and it was the configuration that Tripp had specifically described. It could not be built. The obstacle was an FAA regulation, not a technical limitation. The Federal Aviation Administration required that any commercial passenger aircraft be capable of complete evacuation in less than 90 seconds, using only half the available emergency exits in case the other half were blocked or inaccessible. A fully double-decked fuselage of the size Tripp was requesting would have been extremely difficult to evacuate in 90 seconds under ideal conditions. In a real emergency, with the chaos and bottlenecks that emergency evacuations actually produce, the regulations simply could not be met. Sutter's solution changed commercial aviation permanently, and it is worth pausing to understand exactly what he decided. Rather than 2 floors of conventional width, Sutter proposed a single main passenger deck of entirely unconventional width, wide enough for 10 seats across, separated by 2 aisles rather than the single aisle of every narrow-body aircraft that had preceded it, wide enough for 2 standard freight pallets placed side by side on the main deck, making the aircraft as effective as a freighter as it was as a passenger carrier without any conversion, wide enough that the fuselage itself, seen end-on, was a shape that had never appeared in a commercial aircraft, a wide oval rather than a narrow circle. This was the birth of the wide-body concept, And it is the reason that every large twin-aisle aircraft built anywhere in the world in the decades since, every 777, every A330, every 787, every A350, shares its essential cross-sectional logic with the 747. The specific solution Sutter arrived at under the constraint of the 90-second evacuation rule became the defining characteristic of large aircraft design for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Sutter was described by Air and Space Smithsonian Magazine as the father of the 747, and the label is both accurate and insufficient, in the way that such labels always are for people who made decisions of genuine consequence. He did not simply execute a design that had been handed to him. He identified the core constraint, proposed a solution that went well beyond the minimum required to address it, and in doing so, produced something more useful than what he had been asked for. The full double-decker Trip A had originally requested would have been a large aircraft. The wide-body single-deck configuration Sutter proposed was a new category. He had 2 years to turn this decision into engineering reality. The aircraft needed to be ready for service in 1970, which meant the design needed to be complete, the factory needed to be built, and the aircraft needed to be manufactured, flight-tested, and certified within a time frame that would have been ambitious for a conventional aircraft of known design, and was genuinely daunting for something that had never existed before in any form. To meet this deadline, Sutter began hiring engineers, eventually assembling a team of 4,500 people assigned exclusively to the 747 program, one of the largest engineering concentrations ever organized around a single aircraft. He gave them a target and a timeline, and then he held them to both with the particular combination of technical exacting standards and personal loyalty to his team that the people who worked for him consistently described as the defining characteristic of his leadership. He also, at one critical moment when Boeing's finances were under severe strain from the cost of the program, refused a direct order to lay off 1,000 of those engineers. His reasoning was simple. Laying off 1,000 engineers would make it impossible to finish the aircraft on schedule, which meant the aircraft would either not arrive when airlines needed it or would arrive wrong. Neither outcome was acceptable. He refused. The engineers stayed. Their team had no name yet. It would acquire one, later, that it had earned. The most recognizable feature of the Boeing 747, the feature that makes it instantly distinguishable at any distance from any other aircraft ever built, is a shape that was not originally intended to be seen at all. The hump, the raised upper section at the front of the fuselage that gives the 747 its distinctive profile, exists because of a decision about cargo. Specifically, it exists because the aircraft was designed, from its earliest conception, to be converted into a freighter. The reasoning behind this was the same logic that had shaped Trip A's original request. In 1965, the aviation industry widely believed that supersonic commercial aircraft were coming within the decade, and that when they arrived, they would rapidly take over the premium long-haul passenger market. The subsonic jets would be left to carry cargo. Trip A and the Boeing team built this assumption into the 747's requirements from the start. If passenger demand faded as supersonic aircraft arrived, the 747 needed to be convertible to a freighter quickly and inexpensively, rather than being stranded as a passenger aircraft in a market that no longer needed it. The most efficient way to load large cargo into a wide-body aircraft is through the nose, because a nose-loading door can accommodate freight of any length, unconstrained by the width of a side door. But loading through the nose requires the nose to open, which requires the nose section to hinge upward or swing to one side, which creates an immediate problem. If the nose opens, there can be no cockpit in the nose, because the cockpit is what you would be removing when you swung it aside to load freight. Sutter's solution was to move the cockpit. Rather than sitting in the conventional position at the very front of the aircraft, the 747's cockpit was elevated above the main deck, positioned on the upper level at the front of the fuselage. Behind and above the nose section that could be designed to hinge upward for cargo loading. The cockpit sat in a pod above the main deck, connected to the forward fuselage structure, and the space between the floor of that cockpit pod and its ceiling formed the 747's upper deck, a short enclosed section forward of the wings with its own windows, its own access stairway from the main cabin below, and enough space for a modest lounge or a small number of additional seats. This elevated cockpit, combined with the upper deck it created, is exactly the hump. It exists because the nose needed to open, and the nose needed to open because the aircraft might eventually become a freighter, and the aircraft might eventually become a freighter because supersonic jets were expected to make passenger 747s unnecessary within 10 years of their introduction. The supersonic jets largely never materialized at scale. The 747 flew passengers for 53 years. The hump remained, serving as a lounge, and then a premium cabin, and then a crew rest area, and then the most exclusive seats in the sky, outlasting every assumption that had produced it. The engineering numbers that surrounded this design phase are worth a moment's attention. By the time the 747 design was sufficiently complete to begin manufacturing, Sutter's team had produced 75,000 individual engineering drawings. A single 747 contains approximately 4.5 million separate parts, not counting the millions of fasteners required to hold them together. The electrical wiring in one aircraft, if laid end to end in a single line, would extend for 218 kilometers. A single 747 requires 5 landing gear legs, 4 independent hydraulic systems, and 10 million labor hours to assemble from parts to finished aircraft. These are not rough estimates. They are the documented outputs of a program that required Sutter's team to know exactly what they were building, because the alternative to precision at this scale was not an approximation, but a catastrophe. The aircraft that contained all of this needed somewhere to be built. No existing Boeing facility was large enough to accommodate its assembly. Boeing purchased a large tract of land near Everett, Washington, adjacent to Payne Field, where the eventual first flight would take place, and began constructing an entirely new manufacturing complex from the ground up, while the 747 design was still being finalized. The building that resulted, completed in 1967, enclosed approximately 472 million cubic feet of space, and was, when it opened, the largest building in the world by volume. It remains so today. The factory effectively created a city. Everett, Washington grew rapidly around the Boeing complex as workers and their families settled near the plant, transforming what had been a relatively modest community north of Seattle into a small city organized almost entirely around the manufacturing of large aircraft. The building did not simply house the 747 program. It housed the economy and community life of an entire region, and its workers, 4,500 of them in the engineering team alone, before the broader construction and assembly workforce was counted, were about to build something that had never existed. The rollout of the first completed 747 airframe took place on September 30th, 1968, less than 3 years after Trippe and Allen's fishing lodge conversation, and 29 months after design work had formally begun. The rollout of a new aircraft is a ceremony that the aviation industry has developed over decades into a specific kind of event. A factory door opens. An aircraft emerges into public view for the first time. The people who built it gather in front of it for photographs, and everyone present tries to make the scale of what has just happened legible within the compressed time frame of a single occasion. On September 30th, 1968, Boeing did this with the first 747, rolling it out through the enormous doors of the Everett factory before a crowd of employees, airline representatives, journalists, and officials who had gathered specifically to see something that, until that moment, they had known only through specifications and diagrams and scale models. What they saw was an aircraft that was visibly, unmistakably larger than anything that had ever come before it. This sounds like a simple observation. At a distance, it is. At close range, in a factory environment where the scale references are other large aircraft and the buildings that house them, the effect is something closer to disorientation. The people who worked on the 747 design and assembly program and who attended the rollout described the experience of standing next to the completed aircraft for the first time as a moment that stopped ordinary language and required a different register. Something very large and very carefully made had been produced by people who were not entirely sure, until that moment, that they had actually succeeded. They had succeeded because Sutter had refused to let them fail, and because he had held his team together during the months when Boeing's finances had placed genuine pressure on the program. The cost of designing and manufacturing an entirely new aircraft of this size, in this time frame, while simultaneously building the factory required to house it, had pushed Boeing into a level of debt that created real concern about the company's survival. Boeing was funding the 747 program almost entirely with its own resources, without the kind of government support that the development of military aircraft typically generated, and the financial exposure was considerable. At the point of maximum pressure, Boeing's management asked Sutter to reduce his engineering workforce by 1,000 people. The request was framed as a financial necessity, a measure to reduce the program's cost to a level the company could sustain while still completing the aircraft. Sutter refused. His reasoning, delivered directly and without lengthy qualification, was that removing 1,000 engineers from the program at that stage would make it impossible to complete the aircraft on the timeline the airline customers required, which meant Boeing would either deliver late, lose the orders that depended on on-time delivery, or both. The financial saving was real. The operational consequence was worse than the problem it addressed. He refused. The engineers stayed. That team, 4,500 strong across the engineering program, later acquired a description that has stayed attached to them in the historical record, the Incredibles. The name captures something accurate about what they produced. 29 months from the formal beginning of the design program to the rollout of a completed airframe of a type that had never existed before, an aircraft with 4.5 million parts, 75,000 engineering drawings, 218 kilometers of electrical wiring, 5 landing gear legs, and a fuselage cross-section that had redefined what a commercial aircraft could look like. The superlative is not hyperbole applied to a moderately impressive engineering effort. It is an accurate description of what 4,500 people accomplished in 2.5 years, under financial pressure, with a design that was genuinely new rather than an incremental improvement on something that already worked. The Everett factory that housed the program was itself among the most significant constructions of the era. Buildings exist, at industrial scale, to serve the things they contain, and the thing this building had been constructed to contain had imposed on it a set of requirements that produced a structure with no real precedent. The factory enclosed 472 million cubic feet of space, an interior volume large enough that the building generates its own localized weather systems. On humid days, fog has been observed forming at ceiling level inside the factory, high enough above the floor that aircraft parked below it have remained unaffected. The building has its own weather. The aircraft inside it had changed aviation. What the rollout ceremony on September 30th, 1968 marked was the transition from building to flying. The aircraft that had emerged from the factory doors was complete as a structure. It now needed engines that worked, systems that functioned under load, and a test program that would confirm, in the air rather than on paper, that the calculations underlying 75,000 drawings and 10 million labor hours were correct. Joe Sutter had already told anyone who asked that he knew exactly where on the runway this aircraft was going to leave the ground. He had calculated it. On the morning of February 9th, 1969, they were going to find out whether he was right. The morning of February 9th, 1969 was clear at Payne Field in Everett, Washington, cold in the way that Pacific Northwest winters are cold, which is to say persistently rather than dramatically. The first Boeing 747 prototype, registered N7470 and named the city of Everett, sat on the runway in front of a small crowd of Boeing engineers, airline representatives, and aviation journalists who had come to watch something that had never happened before: a 703,500-pound aircraft attempt to leave the ground. In the cockpit were three men: Jack Waddell, Boeing's chief test pilot, in the left seat, Brian Weigel, second in command, in the right seat, and Jess Wallach at the flight engineers station behind them. Sutter and the rest of the engineering team were on the ground. They had spent months preparing for this day, running systems checks and taxi tests and reviewing every variable they could control. And now, the variable they could not control, the air, the runway, the relationship between the aircraft's weight and its wings, and the morning's atmospheric conditions, was about to produce its answer. Sutter had done something that test pilots found notable. He had calculated, from the aircraft's performance data, exactly where on the runway the 747 would lift off. Not an approximation, not a range within which it was likely to rotate, but a specific point that he had marked out in advance and described to the people watching from the runway's edge. The calculation required confidence in the underlying engineering that most engineers at this stage of a test program tend to hedge. Sutter did not hedge. He told the observers, "The aircraft will leave the ground here." The city of Everett lifted off at 11:34 a.m. Pacific time. It left the ground at the precise point Sutter had indicated. The flight lasted approximately 1 hour and 16 minutes. During that time, the aircraft reached 15,000 feet of altitude, flew at speeds of up to 280 miles per hour, and covered a route that took it over Puget Sound before returning to Payne Field. There was a minor problem with one of the trailing edge flaps during the flight, which the crew noted in their post-flight report and which required attention before the next test, but which did not affect the fundamental performance of the aircraft or the conduct of the test program. What the test crew found, and what Sutter had predicted, was that the 747 was a notably stable and well-behaved aircraft to fly. Specifically, it was resistant to Dutch roll, an aerodynamic instability that occurs in swept-wing aircraft when a yawing motion and a rolling motion couple together, feeding each other in a lateral oscillation that, in earlier swept-wing jets, had been a genuine handling hazard requiring careful pilot management. The 747's design, its wide fuselage, and the geometry of its wings made it significantly less susceptible to this problem than the aircraft that had preceded it, and the test pilot's feedback on this characteristic was consistently positive through the testing program that followed. The 5 test aircraft that Boeing used across the certification program flew a combined total of 1,449 hours in 1,013 flights before the FAA type certificate was issued. The 747 was displayed publicly for the first time in June 1969 at the Paris Air Show, where it appeared alongside the competing aircraft of its era and made clear, in the simple visual terms that an air show provides, how completely it occupied a scale category of its own. The Boeing display at Paris was, by any measure, a success. The FAA granted the 747's type certificate on December 31, 1969, clearing it for commercial passenger service with the airlines that had ordered it. The certification was the formal conclusion of the test program and the formal beginning of the aircraft's operational life. But it came with an awareness, among the engineering team that had built the aircraft, that the first year of service would be its own kind of test. The wake turbulence the 747 generated behind it was more significant than that of any previous aircraft, and the FAA would move quickly in 1970 to implement specific separation requirements for aircraft flying behind a 747 on approach. The French government would temporarily bar Pan Am from flying 747s into Paris during the aircraft's first year of service, citing concerns about wake turbulence at Charles de Gaulle. These were real operational issues, and Boeing addressed them through additional testing in 1970. The city of Everett's February flight was the beginning of all of this. the opening note of a program that would last 54 more years and produce 1,573 additional aircraft. It lifted off where Sutter had said it would, flew where its calculations had indicated it would fly, and landed safely, to the precise satisfaction of a man who had known, before the wheels left the ground, that the mathematics were correct. Pan Am's first revenue service was now 10 months away. The aircraft that would carry its first 335 passengers had a name yet to be decided. Pan Am's first 747 had been registered N733PA and named Clipper Young America, in the tradition Pan Am maintained of giving names to its flagship aircraft. Shortly before the inaugural service, the name was exchanged with another aircraft in the fleet, Clipper Constitution, but it was Clipper Young America that carried the new name on January 22, 1970, and it is Clipper Young America that entered history. The formal introduction of Pan Am's new aircraft to the American public had taken place a week earlier, on January 15, 1970, at Dulles International Airport outside Washington. Pat Nixon, the First Lady of the United States, christened the aircraft in a ceremony attended by Pan Am officials and Boeing representatives. The traditional convention for christening a ship or aircraft is to break a bottle of champagne against the hull. Pan Am chose differently. Red, white, and blue water was sprayed on the aircraft instead of champagne, a substitution that reflected either the prevailing sensibilities of the occasion or a considered decision about what impression Pan Am wished to project. The inaugural revenue service had been planned for the evening of January 21, 1970. Pan Am had arranged the event with care, inviting press, dignitaries, and a full complement of passengers for what was meant to be the first commercial flight of the largest aircraft ever to carry paying customers. On the evening of January 21, the aircraft designated for the flight developed an engine overheating problem that made it unserviceable. A replacement aircraft was located, serviced, and prepared. The process took more than 6 hours. The flight that should have departed on the evening of January 21 finally departed in the early hours of January 22, carrying 335 passengers and 20 crew members from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York to London Heathrow. It arrived in London on the morning of January 22, 1970. The delay had pushed the inaugural across midnight in New York, which is why the date of the first commercial 747 service is January 22 rather than the 21st, for which it had been scheduled. The Queen of the Skies entered service approximately 6 hours late, which, given the number of things that could have gone wrong with the introduction of an entirely new category of aircraft into commercial service, was a remarkably minor disruption to a historically significant day. The passenger experience on that inaugural flight and on the 747 services that followed in the months immediately after, was unlike anything previously available on a commercial aircraft at any price. The cabin was wider than anything passengers had sat in before, with 10 seats across, separated by 2 aisles that allowed people to move about the aircraft in a way that the narrow corridors of earlier jets had made impractical. The ceiling was 8 feet high, a figure that seems unremarkable until you have spent time in the lower-ceilinged cabins of aircraft built before the wide-body era and then stepped aboard a 747 for the first time. The space felt, to most first-time passengers, qualitatively different from prior air travel, less like boarding a vehicle and more like entering a room. The competition responded quickly. Within months of Pan Am's inaugural service, TWA had introduced its own 747 service, followed shortly by Lufthansa, Air France, and Japan Airlines. Boeing had estimated that roughly half of its early 747 orders were driven by airlines seeking the aircraft's range capabilities rather than its passenger capacity, wanting the ability to operate non-stop routes that had previously required intermediate stops. This assessment proved accurate. The 747's combination of capacity and range made it the instrument through which airlines rerouted significant portions of international long-haul traffic across the early 1970s. During the 1970s and into the 1980s, more than 30 regularly scheduled 747s could often be observed simultaneously at John F. Kennedy International Airport. This figure, which reflects both the volume of transatlantic traffic and the extent to which the 747 had become the default choice for premium long-haul routes, was something that the aviation industry of 1965 would have considered extraordinary. In 1965, the 707 was the dominant transatlantic aircraft, and its cabin held perhaps 140 passengers in a mixed configuration. The aircraft that replaced it on those same routes carried more than twice that number, at lower cost per seat, in accommodations that were by any measure more comfortable. The first passengers on Clipper Young America had bought tickets for a flight from New York to London. What they had actually paid for, though none of them could have known it at the time, was a preview of the way international air travel would function for the next 5 decades. The wide-body jet, the twin aisle, the 8-foot ceiling, the sense of scale that distinguished boarding a 747 from boarding everything that came before it. These became the baseline expectations of long-haul commercial aviation from that January morning onward. The aircraft could do things with space that no one had done before. What the airlines did with that space, particularly in the months and years immediately following the inaugural, was something that no aircraft before or since has quite replicated. In the early years of 747 service, the upper deck was not a cabin. It was something more specific and more particular, a room to go to. Pan Am's original upper deck configuration converted the small elevated space above the main deck into what the airline promoted as a restaurant in the sky. First-class passengers, who had already been served a meal in their seats below, could ascend the spiral staircase at the forward end of the main cabin and find a separate space arranged around tables rather than rows, with a full service menu, including roast beef carved tableside, and a level of unhurried attention from the crew that the logistics of a main cabin meal service could not match. Surveys conducted by Pan Am during the aircraft's first years of service indicated that approximately 30% of its first-class passengers had chosen Pan Am specifically because of the upper deck restaurant. 1 in 3 first-class passengers on the most prestigious transatlantic route in commercial aviation had made their airline choice based on what could be found up the spiral staircase. The spiral staircase itself became, within months of the 747's introduction, one of the most immediately recognizable interior features in aviation. It was narrow, compact, and deliberately elegant, connecting the main deck to the upper deck in a way that communicated, from the first step, that ascending it was a movement towards something different and more deliberately luxurious than what was available below. Its design had a precedent in Boeing's own history. The company's earlier Model 377 Stratocruiser, a long-range propeller-driven aircraft that had entered service in 1947, had also featured a lower lounge accessible by stairs from the main cabin, and the 747's spiral staircase evoked, for passengers old enough to remember it, the golden age of long-range piston aviation. Different airlines configured the upper deck differently, according to their own sense of what first-class passengers on long-haul routes most wanted. Qantas named its upper deck the Captain Cook Lounge and furnished it with a nautical theme, ocean charts hung on the walls, decorative ropes, and a wooden ship's wheel mounted at the forward end opposite a stand-up bar. The effect, at altitude over the Pacific, was of a ship's captain's quarters transplanted to an aircraft at 35,000 feet, an aesthetic decision that was either quite clever or slightly eccentric, depending on your disposition toward nautical metaphor in aviation contexts. The Captain Cook Lounge was genuinely popular. Passengers who flew Qantas's Pacific routes in the 1970s recalled it with the specific nostalgia that attaches to pleasures that are genuinely unusual and genuinely gone. Some carriers placed piano bars not on the upper deck but in the rear of the main cabin, accessible to coach passengers rather than confined to first class. The specific combination of a long ocean crossing, an aircraft wide enough to contain a working piano, and a professional musician hired as part of the cabin crew produced a social environment that had no real precedent in aviation and has not been replicated since. Accounts from passengers who flew these configurations describe the rear lounge of a 747 in the 1970s as closer in atmosphere to a cocktail party aboard a very large ship than to any conventional flight experience. The spiral staircase that had defined this era of upper deck use was replaced on the 747-300, introduced in 1983, with a straight stairway that allowed the upper deck to be extended by 23 feet and configured for regular seat rows rather than lounge seating. The economics of high-volume passenger operations had gradually overtaken the logic of dedicating upper deck space to a cocktail lounge on most routes and most airlines. The space that had once held swivel chairs and a ship's wheel became rows of business-class seats, which was a commercially sensible outcome and a loss of something that had no direct commercial equivalent. The 747-400, introduced in 1989, offered the upper deck with 20 windows on each side and a straight stairway wide enough to allow proper meal service to passengers seated above, making the upper deck a conventional premium cabin rather than a social space. Airlines increasingly assigned their best business and first-class products to the upper deck, recognizing that the slight remove from the main cabin noise and activity and the smaller number of passengers sharing the space created conditions that premium travelers were prepared to pay notably more for. The final evolution of the upper deck on the 747-8 Intercontinental produced cabins that multiple aviation publications described as among the quietest and most private available in commercial aviation, particularly as configured by Lufthansa and Korean Air. The ship's wheel and the piano were long gone, but the upper deck, which had started as a lounge above a cockpit that existed because a nose needed to open for cargo, had become, in its final form, the most desirable seats in the sky. None of this luxury, however, was what most changed the world. What most changed the world was what the aircraft did to the price of the ticket below the stairs. The relationship between the size of an aircraft and the price of a seat aboard it is one of the more reliable relationships in commercial aviation economics, and it is the relationship that explains most of what the 747 did to the world between 1970 and the end of the century. Before the 747, a transatlantic round trip in economy class cost roughly the equivalent of several weeks of an average American worker's salary. The ticket was affordable by the late 1960s, in the sense that it was within the theoretical financial reach of many middle-class households, but it required genuine planning and real sacrifice, and most people who made the trip treated it as a significant event rather than a routine transaction. Air travel was accessible. It was not yet ordinary. The 747 changed this in a specific and measurable way. An aircraft carrying twice as many passengers as its predecessor, on a route with similar operating costs per flight, can offer those seats at roughly half the cost per passenger, assuming comparable load factors. The 747 did not quite achieve a 50% reduction in per-seat cost, because its operating costs were higher than its predecessors in absolute terms, but the reduction it enabled was substantial, and its effects across the 1970s and 1980s were visible in the transformation of international air travel from an aspirational to a routine activity for middle-class populations in developed economies. The country that felt this most clearly was Australia. Before the 747, the flight from London or New York to Sydney required intermediate stops, took the better part of 2 days in total travel time, and cost enough that regular international travel between Australia and its major commercial partners in Europe and North America was practically limited to business and government travelers. The 747's combination of range and capacity made Australia accessible to a much broader population of European and American travellers, and Australian aviation historians have consistently credited the aircraft with opening Australia to the world, a phrase Qantas itself used in its own marketing of the 747 for decades. The effects on Australian tourism, immigration, and cultural life in the 1970s and 1980s are traceable, at least in part, to the cost reduction that one aircraft made possible. Japan saw a different expression of the same phenomenon. Joe Sutter, who travelled frequently to Asia on business during his post-retirement consulting years, developed the habit of watching 747s at airports during his layovers, counting aircraft and estimating the number of people they carried. On one trip to Narita International Airport in Tokyo, in the mid-1980s, he counted 55 747s arriving during a 2-hour period at the airport. Sutter estimated, assuming each aircraft was roughly 75% occupied, that those 55 aircraft had carried approximately 20,000 people into Tokyo within the 2 hours he spent watching. He described seeing the 747s clustered at Narita as thickly as narrow-body 737s cluster at American airports, an image that captures, in immediate visual terms, what the jumbo jet had done to the scale of international travel. In the early 1970s, during a period when the recession and the oil crisis of 1973 were putting genuine financial pressure on many airlines, several carriers that had ordered 747s purely to compete with Pan Am found the aircraft's economics difficult to manage when seats were not full. The 747 had the lowest potential operating cost per seat of any aircraft when it was fully loaded, but costs per seat rose quickly as occupancy declined, and a 747 operating at 70% of its seating capacity used more than 95% of the fuel it would have burned at full capacity. Some airlines purchased the aircraft, as Boeing itself later noted, due to its iconic status, even if it made no sense economically to operate at the load factors they were achieving. This last detail is itself a kind of testament. Airlines made commercially irrational decisions to operate the 747 because the alternative, appearing at major international airports without one, felt like a statement of inadequacy in the era when the aircraft had become synonymous with serious long-haul aviation. The Queen had a gravitational pull on airline strategy that had as much to do with prestige as with per-seat economics, which is a condition that very few aircraft in history have achieved, and which reflects something about the 747's position in the public imagination of the 1970s that pure operational data cannot capture. The world that existed by the mid-1980s, in which a middle-class family in a developed country could reasonably consider a long-haul international flight as a normal vacation option, was substantially the product of the 747's existence and its particular relationship between size and cost. That world had not existed before January 22, 1970, when 335 people paid to fly from New York to London on Clipper Young America, and the economics of getting from one continent to another permanently changed. The aircraft that produced this change was not standing still while it changed the world. It was being developed, improved, extended, and re-engineered across its production life in ways that would eventually produce 5 distinct major variants. The 747 that Pan Am flew on January 22, 1970, was designated the 747-100, the original production variant, and it was in several respects the first generation of an aircraft that would continue developing for more than 5 decades. Every major commercial aircraft accumulates variants across its production life as engineers improve its engines, extend its range, adjust its capacity, and adapt its design to the requirements of operators who find, in practice, that the original specification does not quite fit every route or mission they want to fly. The 747 accumulated more of these variants than most, and each one tells something about where the aircraft was, and where aviation was, at the moment the variant was produced. The 747-200 which entered service in 1971, introduced more powerful engines and greater fuel capacity, extending the aircraft's range and increasing its maximum takeoff weight. The changes were evolutionary rather than revolutionary, the kind of improvement that any production aircraft undergoes once operators have a few years of real-world experience with the original version, and the engineering team understands precisely which performance parameters matter most to the people flying it commercially. The -200 became the workhorse variant of the 1970s, operated by most of the major airlines that had ordered 747s and used on the full range of transatlantic and trans-Pacific routes that the 747 had helped to establish. The 747 SP, introduced in 1976, was a different kind of development, a deliberate shortening of the aircraft to achieve a specific goal. SP stood for Special Performance, and the performance in question was range. By removing 48 feet from the fuselage, reducing the cabin length and passenger capacity significantly compared to the standard variants, Boeing's engineers were able to create a version of the 747 that was substantially lighter than its siblings, and that could therefore carry a full fuel load and a modest passenger complement farther than any commercial aircraft had yet flown non-stop. The 747 SP made possible something that could not be done with any existing aircraft. In March 1976, Pan Am used a 747 SP to inaugurate the first non-stop commercial service between New York and Tokyo, flying over the North Pole on a routing that cut the journey to a duration that had previously required multiple stops and layovers across several days. The polar routing was made possible specifically by the SP's combination of range and the favorable distance across the top of the globe between those two cities. Passengers on that inaugural service went from New York to Tokyo in a single continuous flight, which was, at that moment, the longest scheduled non-stop commercial route in the world. The 747 SP also set numerous long-distance records during its operational career, including a round-the-world speed record in 1976. It looked distinctly different from the standard 747, its shorter fuselage giving it proportions that regular 747 passengers found slightly disorienting, the familiar hump and wing and engine arrangement, but compressed into a body that seemed too abbreviated, as if something had been removed from the middle that was supposed to be there. Something had, and the removed section was the weight that would otherwise have prevented the aircraft from reaching the destinations the SP existed specifically to serve. The 747-300, introduced in 1983, took the opposite approach to the SP's reduction, adding capacity upward rather than removing it below. The most visible change on the -300 was the stretched upper deck, which extended the elevated forward section of the fuselage by 23 feet and 4 inches, transforming what had been a small lounge area of modest capacity into a full upper passenger cabin capable of seating up to 69 people in a two-class configuration. The extension removed the famous spiral staircase that had connected the decks on the -100 and -200 variants, and replaced it with a wider, straight stairway capable of supporting proper meal service to seated passengers above, a change that was practical and slightly melancholy in equal measure. The -300 also improved slightly on cruise speed, reaching Mach 0.85 compared to the 0.84 of its predecessors, a difference that accumulated meaningfully on long routes. The stretched upper deck was made available as a retrofit option for airlines that had existing ×200 aircraft and wanted the capacity increase without buying new aircraft, and several operators took up this option, producing aircraft with the -200's body but the -300's upper section, a configuration that became known as the stretched upper deck or SUD modification. By the mid-1980s, the 747 family had covered its first generation of development: the original, the long-range workhorse, the ultra-long-range specialist, and the capacity expansion. The fleet was mature, proven, and flying millions of people annually, on routes that had not existed before the aircraft made them viable. The next major step would not be more of the same. It would be something genuinely new, a cockpit that had been rethought from the floor up, and a crew requirement that had been reduced by one. The flight engineer's position, which Jess Wallach had occupied on the City of Everett's first flight in 1969, was about to be designed out of existence. The flight engineer's station on early 747s sat behind the two pilots, facing a panel of gauges, dials, switches, and warning lights that covered an area roughly the size of a refrigerator door. It was a third pair of eyes on the aircraft's systems, a trained specialist whose role was to monitor engine performance, fuel state, hydraulic pressure, electrical generation, pressurization, and dozens of other parameters that were too numerous and too complex for two pilots to track simultaneously while also flying the aircraft. Every large multi-engine aircraft of the post-war era carried a flight engineer as standard, and the 747 was no different. Jess Wallach's station on the City of Everett's first flight in 1969 was the direct continuation of a role that had existed since before the jet age. The 747-400, which entered service with Northwest Airlines in 1989, was the first variant of the aircraft to fly without one. The elimination of the flight engineer position was not a cost-cutting measure in the pejorative sense, though it did reduce crew costs meaningfully. It was the product of a genuine technological transition, the replacement of the analog instrument panel with digital computers that could monitor all the systems the flight engineer had previously watched, process the incoming data faster than a human could, and present the crew with synthesized information rather than raw readings that required trained interpretation. The 747-400's glass cockpit replaced the banks of round analog gauges with cathode ray tube displays, later updated to modern flat screens that consolidated information from hundreds of sensors into formats the two pilots could read at a glance. The practical effect was a cockpit that was simultaneously more informative and simpler to manage. A 747-100 pilot, transitioning to a 747-400, encountered something that looked, in its fundamentals, like the same aircraft in a completely different language. The information was the same. The manner of its presentation and the human workload required to use it were transformed. Winglets were the other defining visible change on the 747-400, and they are worth a careful look because they are easy to take for granted. The upturned extensions at the tip of each wing, roughly 6 feet tall on the 747-400, look like a stylistic flourish, a design detail added for aesthetics rather than engineering. They are not. A wing moving through air generates lift across its span, and at the tip, where the high-pressure air beneath the wing rolls around the edge to meet the low-pressure air above, a vortex forms that trails behind the aircraft and constitutes a form of drag called induced drag. The winglet interrupts this rollover at the tip, reducing the strength of the vortex and therefore the drag it generates. The reduction in induced drag improved the 747-400's fuel efficiency and increased its range compared to earlier variants without any change to the wing structure itself, producing performance gains from what is essentially a shaped sheet of aluminum at the end of each wing. The 747-400's range of approximately 8,000 nautical miles was meaningfully greater than any of its predecessors, allowing non-stop service between city pairs that the -200 and -300 had required refueling stops to connect. Airlines used this extended reach to build route networks that had not previously been feasible, consolidating long-haul services onto the dashed 400 as the variant that could go farther with fewer compromises. The commercial response to the 747-400 was the strongest of any 747 variant. Boeing delivered 694 of them across a production run that lasted from 1988 to 2009, a total that exceeded the combined production of all other 747 variants before it. British Airways, which built one of the most extensive 747 operations in the world, eventually operated more than 100 747 400s, making the aircraft a defining feature of long-haul aviation at London Heathrow for more than 2 decades. Japan Airlines, Singapore Airlines, Cathay Pacific, and Qantas maintained large 747-400 fleets that became the backbone of trans-Pacific service through the 1990s and into the 2000s. What the 747-400 represented, beyond its specific technical achievements, was the point at which the Queen had fully grown into her title. The -100 had been a remarkable first attempt at something unprecedented. The -200 and -300 had been refinements of the basic concept. The -400 was a mature aircraft, confident in its design, equipped with the technology its era could provide, and producing performance that made it the dominant long-haul aircraft in the world for nearly 2 decades. The flight engineer's analog panel, the rotating instruments of the first cockpits, the manual systems that the Incredibles had engineered in 1966 and 1967 were gone. In their place was something that Sutter's engineers could not have designed in the time available to them in 1965, because the technology had not yet existed. The 747 had arrived at its mature form, and that form would carry passengers and cargo across every ocean in the world for another 30 years. What some of those passengers and the general public may not have realized was how far beyond carrying people the 747 had already extended itself, in roles that the fishing lodge conversation between Trippe and Allen had not mentioned and that no airline brochure described. When Joe Sutter designed the 747's nose to open, he was solving a problem that the passenger version of the aircraft never actually required solving. In 53 years of commercial passenger service, no airline ever boarded a single traveler through the nose of a 747. The hinged nose section that made the cockpit's elevated position necessary, and that gave the aircraft its hump, was always a feature of the aircraft's other identity, the 747 as a cargo carrier. The role its designers had built in from the beginning, on the assumption that passengers would eventually want supersonic travel, and freight would not. The supersonic passengers largely did not materialize. The freight never stopped growing. Lufthansa inaugurated the world's first scheduled 747 freighter service in 1972, operating the 747-200F on cargo routes, and remaining the only airline flying the type in freight configuration for nearly 2 years before other operators followed. The 747-200F's nose opened fully forward of the cockpit on a hinge mounted below the cockpit windows, revealing an unobstructed opening wide enough and tall enough to admit cargo that no side-loading door could accommodate. This was not merely a convenience. It was a structural capability that made the 747 freighter able to carry objects that would otherwise have no air freight option at all. Oversized industrial equipment, large vehicle components, humanitarian cargo on pallets designed for industrial-scale logistics, the infrastructure of modern global supply chains, packed into aluminum boxes and loaded by forklift directly into an aircraft capable of carrying it across an ocean overnight. The standard measurement for air freight capacity is payload in metric tons. A 747 x 8 freighter, the latest and largest cargo variant, carries approximately 137 metric tons of payload, an amount roughly equivalent to the cargo capacity of a medium-sized cargo ship, compressed into an aircraft that crosses the Atlantic in 8 hours rather than 8 days. The comparison is not entirely fair to either mode of transport, since ship cargo is far cheaper per ton and serves very different logistics purposes. But the contrast captures something accurate about what the freight 747 represented in the history of international trade. The practical possibility of sending large quantities of goods across oceanic distances in timescales that made overnight international shipping a real commercial service rather than an exception for the most urgent and expensive cargo. FedEx, which operates one of the largest fleets of 747 freighters in the world, has made the 747 central to its international overnight delivery network for decades. UPS operates a comparable fleet on parallel routes. Atlas Air, which would eventually take delivery of the final 747 ever built its entire business model around the 747 freighter's capabilities on long-haul cargo routes, where payload, range, and the ability to land at airports without specialized wide-body cargo facilities made the 747's particular combination of characteristics uniquely useful. The cargo 747 was, in several respects, a more faithful realization of what Sutter had originally designed than the passenger version it had always accompanied. The wide main deck that could carry 2 freight pallets side by side was a design choice from the beginning. The nose loading that required the cockpit's elevation above the main deck was a design choice from the beginning. The aircraft that Sutter had built to be convertible to a freighter if passengers went supersonic became, in the end, the freighter that outlasted the passenger version, still flying decades after most airlines had retired their 747 passenger fleets and moved to twin-engine aircraft. The freighter's endurance is partly a function of routes. Long-haul cargo services operate on economics that are different from passenger routes. The cost of a seat is not a relevant variable, and the aircraft's fuel burn per available ton-mile is what matters. At very long range and very high payload, the 747 freighter's 4 engines continue to make sense, in a way that the passenger 747's 4 engines stopped making economic sense once twin-engine alternatives became available. A 747-8F, flying a direct polar route from Louisville to Cologne with 137 metric tons of freight, is doing something that no twin-engine freighter currently in service can match in a single non-stop flight with that payload. The shape in the sky that this creates, a 747 with its registration painted in the colors of a freight company, its passenger windows replaced by a blank fuselage skin, its nose hinged at the bottom rather than sealed, has become the dominant form in which the 747 now appears in active commercial service. Most airports that still regularly see 747s see them as freighters. The passenger lounges and the spiral staircases and the upper deck restaurants are gone. The aircraft is carrying packages. That it is still flying at all, still carrying its enormous payload across routes that other aircraft cannot serve in the same way, is itself a testament to the durability of the design that 4,500 engineers produced in 29 months in a factory that had never existed before. The Queen was always going to be a freighter. She just took 50 years to fully become one. Somewhere in the United States at this moment, there are 2 Boeing 747s maintained in a state of constant readiness, fueled and staffed, and capable of departure within minutes of an order to move. They do not carry freight. They do not carry paying passengers. Their single responsibility is to carry one specific person, the President of the United States, wherever that person needs to go, in an aircraft that is simultaneously a means of transport, a secure communications center, an airborne office, and, if necessary, a command post capable of directing the full resources of American government from 40,000 feet above the ground. These aircraft are designated VC-25A by the United States Air Force, which operates them as part of the Presidential Airlift Group at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. Their tail numbers are 28,000 and 29,000, and they are popularly known as Air Force One, a name that has become so attached to these specific aircraft that most people assume it is their permanent designation. It is not. Air Force One is technically an air traffic control call sign used for any United States Air Force aircraft carrying the President. When the President boards a Marine Corps helicopter, the call sign becomes Marine One. When the President boards a Navy aircraft, it becomes Navy One. When the President boards either of the 2 VC-25As, the aircraft carrying them becomes Air Force One for the duration of that flight, and the other VC-25A, waiting at the ground, is simply a 747. Both VC-25As are based on the 747-200B airframe, the long-range variant that Boeing produced through the 1970s and 1980s. But they include systems from the 747-400 generation and modifications that go far beyond what Boeing installs on any commercial aircraft. The completion work was done not in Everett, but in Wichita, Kansas, where Boeing's military division added the equipment and systems that transform a large airliner into a flying seat of government. Each aircraft carries approximately 85 telephones. Each is equipped with air-to-air refueling capability, meaning they can be kept aloft indefinitely by tanker aircraft as long as the situation requires. Each carries electronic countermeasures and other self-defense systems that the Air Force does not publicly describe in detail. The interior is arranged in zones corresponding to different functions: a presidential suite with sleeping quarters and an office, a conference room, separate sections for senior staff and Secret Service personnel, a medical area equipped for emergency treatment, and communications equipment sufficient to maintain contact with every element of the U.S. command structure simultaneously. The communications infrastructure alone is reported to be extraordinary in scope. The aircraft can connect to satellite networks, ground-based military communications systems, and civilian infrastructure simultaneously, allowing the president to conduct any function of the office, including launching nuclear weapons if circumstances required, from aboard the aircraft. What a VC-25A is designed to provide is not merely transportation, but full continuity of government in a mobile, airborne platform. The assurance that whatever has happened on the ground, the office of the president remains functional above it. A related but distinct aircraft operates in parallel for different continuity purposes. The E-4B, officially designated the National Airborne Operations Center and sometimes called Night Watch, or by its Cold War nickname, NECAP, is a heavily modified 747-200B operated by the 55th Wing at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. 4 E-4Bs are maintained, at least one of which is on alert at all times. Their mission is to provide an airborne command post in the event of a national emergency severe enough to destroy ground-based command facilities. The E-4B can be refueled in flight, has been tested for survival in nuclear electromagnetic pulse environments, and carries a trailing wire antenna that allows communication with submerged nuclear submarines, one of the most difficult communication challenges in military electronics. Like the VC-25A, the E-4B uses the 747 as the platform for capabilities that have nothing to do with the aircraft's original commercial purpose. Both the current VC-25As are aging. The aircraft are from the 1990s, and maintaining older airframes to the standard that presidential and national security missions require has become progressively more expensive and technically demanding as original parts become scarce. The U.S. Air Force is procuring 2 replacement aircraft, designated VC-25B, based on the 747-8 airframe. When those aircraft eventually enter service, the VC-25As that have carried every American president from George H.W. Bush onward will be retired, and the Queen's role as the literal embodiment of American executive power will transfer to the latest and most advanced variant of the same basic design that Juan Trippe ordered in April 1966. The 747, in other words, will continue to be Air Force One. There is something fitting in this continuity. The same basic design that a commercial airline president ordered to carry paying passengers across the Atlantic more cheaply has become the aircraft that the United States government considers the only appropriate platform for carrying its head of state across the world safely, and plans to keep flying in that role well into the 2030s, more than 6 decades after the fishing lodge conversation that started everything. There are photographs of it, and the photographs still look wrong even when you know exactly what you are seeing. A Boeing 747, its fuselage intact and its engines running, is flying level at low altitude over the Mojave Desert. On its back, mounted on a structure bolted to the fuselage above and behind the wings, sits a Space Shuttle orbiter, the Combined Silhouette, a massive commercial aircraft with an even more massive spacecraft riding on top of it, is one of the most visually improbable images in the history of aviation, and it was produced not by a simulation or a scale model, but by two real machines performing a real operation that NASA required as a practical matter of logistics. The Space Shuttle orbiters could not fly under their own power in the lower atmosphere. Their engines were rocket engines designed for vacuum, not the dense air of low altitude, and their aerodynamic profile was designed for hypersonic re-entry rather than subsonic flight. An orbiter that landed at the wrong location, or that needed to be moved between facilities, required a carrier aircraft capable of lifting it and transporting it at airliner speeds and altitudes. NASA's solution was to modify two 747s for this purpose, fitting each with a specialized mounting structure above the fuselage and reinforcing the airframe to handle the additional structural loads the shuttle's weight imposed. The first shuttle carrier aircraft, registered N905NA, was a 747-100, originally owned and operated by American Airlines, purchased by NASA and extensively modified for the shuttle carrying role. The second, N911NA, was a 747-100SR, a short-range, high-cycle variant, originally built for Japan Airlines. Both aircraft had their interiors stripped, their engines uprated to handle the additional performance demands of carrying a shuttle, and their aft fuselage sections fitted with the mounting pylons that held the orbiter in place during flight. Small fins were added to the tail to compensate for the aerodynamic disruption the shuttle's massive bulk created in the airflow above and behind the carrier aircraft's normal tail surfaces. N905NA carried the prototype Space Shuttle Enterprise during the approach and landing tests at Edwards Air Force Base in 1977. These tests, which formed part of the program to verify that the shuttle's gliding landing characteristics were acceptable before committing to space flights, involved the Enterprise being released from the 747s back at altitude, gliding unpowered to a landing on the dry lake bed at Edwards. The images of the 747 and the Enterprise in formation flight above the California desert, the white shuttle gleaming against the blue sky above the aircraft that was carrying it, generated a public enthusiasm that NASA leveraged extensively in its early shuttle promotion. The two SCAs together carried all 5 operational Space Shuttle orbiters throughout their careers: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. Each operational shuttle made multiple ferry flights on the back of a 747, transported between Kennedy Space Center in Florida, Edwards Air Force Base in California, Vandenberg Air Force Base, and other facilities as missions and maintenance requirements dictated. The combined weight of a fully assembled 747 and a Space Shuttle orbiter reached approximately 600,000 pounds, a figure that reflects both the shuttle's considerable mass and the substantial fuel required to move that mass through several hours of low-altitude flight. A separate 747 served an entirely different kind of space mission. SOFIA, the Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy, was a modified 747 SP, formerly operated by Pan Am, fitted with a cavity in its rear left fuselage, housing a 2.7-meter diameter infrared telescope. The telescope observed the universe from an altitude of approximately 41,000 feet, above roughly 99% of the water vapor in Earth's atmosphere that blocks infrared radiation and prevents ground-based observatories from making the same observations. SOFIA operated for decades as an airborne observatory, studying planetary atmospheres, star-forming regions, and the interstellar medium from its 747 platform, landing after each mission and making its telescope accessible to researchers for maintenance and instrument changes in ways that a space-based observatory cannot. The 3 uses to which NASA put the 747 as shuttle carrier, as test platform for approach and landing demonstrations, and as the foundation for an airborne astronomical observatory, required in each case a platform that combined the specific capabilities of the 747 that no other aircraft of the era offered: payload capacity, range, altitude capability, and structural robustness sufficient to be modified in ways that would have been impractical or impossible on smaller aircraft. The Queen had not been designed to carry a space shuttle, but she turned out to be exactly large enough to do it. And that scale, which had always been the most remarkable thing about her, was what made her useful in ways that extended far beyond any passenger terminal or freight dock. What neither the shuttle photographs nor the Sophia telescope captured was perhaps the strangest and most human use the 747 was ever put to, which happened not over a desert or an observatory, but over Africa, in a single flight that set a record that has never been broken. On May 24, 1991, the government of Ethiopia was collapsing. The Derg, the military regime that had ruled the country since 1974, was being driven from power by rebel forces advancing on Addis Ababa, and the capital's population was in the early hours of a crisis whose outcome no one could predict with confidence. Among the people in Addis Ababa that day was a community of Ethiopian Jews known as Beta Israel, who had been waiting for years for the opportunity to emigrate to Israel under the law of return. The Israeli government had been working toward a large-scale airlift of this community for months. The collapse of the Derg created both the urgency and, briefly, the political window to attempt it. The operation that followed was called Operation Solomon, and it lasted 36 hours. Between May 24 and May 25, 1991, Israeli Air Force and El Al civilian aircraft flew a continuous shuttle between Addis Ababa and Tel Aviv, carrying members of the Beta Israel community out of Ethiopia as the city around the airport descended further into the chaos of a changing government. The pace of the airlift was constrained by aircraft availability, ground time, and the political volatility of the situation on the ground. Every flight that could be made was made. Every available seat that could be filled was filled. El Al's contribution to Operation Solomon included a Boeing 747-200C, configured for this mission in a specific way. The seats had been removed, not rearranged or reconfigured for higher density, removed. The cabin of the aircraft was a space rather than a cabin, prepared for maximum occupancy by people who would stand, sit on the floor, and hold infants on the journey to Tel Aviv. Ground crews loaded as many people as could be accommodated into the aircraft, and the loading continued until the crew determined that no more could safely be boarded. The official count when that aircraft departed Addis Ababa was 1,087 passengers. The normal maximum certified capacity of a Boeing 747-200 in high-density passenger configuration is approximately 660 people. During the flight from Addis Ababa to Tel Aviv, 2 babies were born aboard the aircraft. The 1,087 passengers arrived in Israel as 1,089. The figure of 1,087 passengers on a single commercial aircraft is a world record that has not been broken. The record is not simply a number. It is a record of what was deemed necessary in a specific set of circumstances, and it is simultaneously the most extreme operational departure from the 747's intended use, and the clearest possible demonstration of what the aircraft's basic engineering parameters actually permitted. The 747 was designed to be large. Its largeness, on that particular day, meant something very specific to more than 1,000 people. The Beta Israel community members who boarded that aircraft in Addis Ababa on May 24, 1991, were not thinking about aviation records. They were thinking about the aircraft getting off the ground and staying there for the few hours required to reach Israel. The record they set was not sought. It was simply the number of people who needed to leave, and the 747 was large enough to carry them. Operation Solomon as a whole airlifted approximately 14,325 people to Israel over its 36 hours. The El Al 747, carrying 1,087 people, was a single flight within a much larger coordinated operation, but it is the number most cited when this operation is discussed in aviation contexts. because it represents a use of the 747 that is unlike any other in the aircraft's history. Not scheduled service, not charter, not cargo, not presidential transport, not shuttle ferry, but a humanitarian mission in which the aircraft's capacity was pressed to its structural and human limits in service of an operation that had to work the first time because there was no opportunity to try again. The records set in more conventional aviation contexts are also notable. The 747 SP, the shortened long-range variant, covered in an earlier chapter, set multiple city pair range records during its operational career, connecting destinations that had required stops in earlier aircraft with non-stop services that reshaped long-haul route networks. A 747 SP set a round-the-world speed record in 1976, completing a global circumnavigation faster than any commercial aircraft had previously managed. What these records share is the 747's tendency to be at the edge of what was thought possible at the time it was doing it. The aircraft that should not have been able to leave the ground, first seen through a gate window, kept finding new ways to do things that seemed, until it did them, like the kind of things a different aircraft would have to be built for. The routes that this aircraft made routine across half a century of service are a different kind of record, written not in a logbook, but in the geography of global travel. The geography of long-haul aviation that exists today. The assumption that non-stop service between most major city pairs in the world is a normal commercial arrangement rather than an exceptional achievement, was built in significant part by a single aircraft type, operating on routes that had not previously been commercially viable in non-stop form. Before the 747, the standard architecture of international long-haul travel involved stops. Transatlantic flights from secondary American cities typically required a connection at New York or a technical fuel stop at Gander, Newfoundland, adding hours to journeys that passengers were already counting in terms of a full day's travel. Trans-Pacific flights stopped in Honolulu, sometimes also in Tokyo, before reaching further Asian destinations. The route between London and Sydney passed through at least 2 intermediate stops, sometimes 3. These stops were not inconveniences in the modern sense of the word. They were structural features of the route network, built in because the aircraft of the 1960s could not carry a full payload the full distance without refueling. The 747, combining range with the economics of high seat capacity, began systematically eliminating these stops from the 1970s onward. The mechanism was straightforward. An aircraft carrying 350 to 400 passengers non-stop between 2 cities generated lower cost per seat than a smaller aircraft making the same journey with a stop, even when the smaller aircraft was cheaper to operate per flight hour. The stop added ground time, required airport facilities, created delay risk, and consumed the passenger's most limited resource, which is time. The 747 eliminated it by carrying enough passengers that the economics of the full fuel load were acceptable. The country whose aviation was most visibly transformed by this process was Australia. The distance from London to Sydney is approximately 10,500 miles, a distance that made truly non-stop service impractical even for the 747 in its early variants. But the 747's combination of range and economics made the one-stop London-Sydney route viable at prices and frequencies that transformed what had been a service for business travellers and migrants into a route that ordinary Australians and Europeans could afford for leisure travel. Qantas, which built its international operation around the 747 and operated one of the largest long-haul 747 fleets in the world, became so identified with the aircraft that it used the name the original Longreach for its final 747, a reference both to the Queensland outback town of Longreach and to the concept of long-reach aviation that the aircraft had made possible. British Airways used its 747 fleet to establish itself as the dominant carrier at London Heathrow on transatlantic and Asian routes. operating more than 100 747-400s at the peak of its commitment to the type. More aircraft of a single type than almost any other airline in history has operated. The 747's combination of capacity, range, and the ability to operate profitably at Heathrow's constrained slot structure made it the foundation of British Airways' long-haul network through the 1990s and 2000s. Japan's integration into global commerce and tourism was shaped in specific ways by the 747's trans-Pacific capabilities. The density of 747 operations at Tokyo's Narita International Airport through the 1980s and 1990s was the physical manifestation of how thoroughly the aircraft had made the Pacific crossing a routine rather than an event. The 747 made it normal for Japanese companies to have employees regularly traveling to the United States and Europe, and for American and European tourists to visit Japan in a volume that would have been logistically impossible with earlier aircraft on earlier economics. The specific routes the 747 made possible, and the cities it connected that were not previously connected non-stop, are too numerous to list individually. The aggregate effect of these connections was to make the physical world smaller in the specific sense that matters for human activity, the time required to move between any 2 points on the planet. This shrinkage was not universal. It was concentrated on the routes that the 747 flew, in the economies that had the money to pay for seats, in the commercial and tourism flows that the aircraft's economics made viable at the price points that produced those flows. The 747 did not make the world smaller for everyone, but for the people and economies it served, the world it inhabited was a genuinely, measurably different size than it had been in 1969. By the time Qantas painted its final 747 with the original long reach and flew it out of Australia for the last time in 2020, the aircraft had been making the world smaller for 50 years, on routes where no substitute had initially existed. What replaced it on those routes was an aircraft that the 747 itself had made commercially possible, by proving that passengers would pay for seats on long-haul, non-stop services, and that the demand for those seats would grow rather than diminish. The final variant of the 747 had already been in the sky for nearly a decade by then, trying its best in a market that had decisively moved on. The geography of long-haul aviation that exists today, the assumption that non-stop service between most major city pairs in the world is a normal commercial arrangement rather than an exceptional achievement, was built in significant part by a single aircraft type operating on routes that had not previously been commercially viable in non-stop form. Before the 747, the standard architecture of international long-haul travel involved stops. Transatlantic flights from secondary American cities typically required a connection at New York or a technical fuel stop at Gander, Newfoundland, adding hours to journeys that passengers were already counting in terms of a full day's travel. Trans-Pacific flights stopped in Honolulu, sometimes also in Tokyo, before reaching further Asian destinations. The route between London and Sydney passed through at least 2 intermediate stops, sometimes 3. These stops were not inconveniences in the modern sense of the word. They were structural features of the route network, built in because the aircraft of the 1960s could not carry a full payload the full distance without refueling. The 747, combining range with the economics of high seat capacity, began systematically eliminating these stops from the 1970s onward. The mechanism was straightforward. An aircraft carrying 350 to 400 passengers non-stop between 2 cities generated lower cost per seat than a smaller aircraft making the same journey with a stop, even when the smaller aircraft was cheaper to operate per flight hour. The stop added ground time, required airport facilities, created delay risk, and consumed the passenger's most limited resource, which is time. The 747 eliminated it by carrying enough passengers that the economics of the full fuel load were acceptable. The country whose aviation was most visibly transformed by this process was Australia. The distance from London to Sydney is approximately 10,500 miles, a distance that made truly non-stop service impractical, even for the 747 in its early variants. But the 747's combination of range and economics made the one-stop London-Sydney route viable at prices and frequencies that transformed what had been a service for business travellers and migrants into a route that ordinary Australians and Europeans could afford for leisure travel. Qantas, which built its international operation around the 747 and operated one of the largest long-haul 747 fleets in the world, became so identified with the aircraft that it used the name the original Longreach for its final 747, a reference both to the Queensland outback town of Longreach and to the concept of long-reach aviation that the aircraft had made possible. British Airways used its 747 fleet to establish itself as the dominant carrier at London Heathrow on transatlantic and Asian routes, operating more than 100 747-400s at the peak of its commitment to the type, more aircraft of a single type than almost any other airline in history has operated. The 747's combination of capacity, range, and the ability to operate profitably at Heathrow's constrained slot structure made it the foundation of British Airways' long-haul network through the 1990s and 2000s. Japan's integration into global commerce and tourism was shaped in specific ways by the 747's trans-Pacific capabilities. The density of 747 operations at Tokyo's Narita International Airport through the 1980s and 1990s was the physical manifestation of how thoroughly the aircraft had made the Pacific crossing a routine rather than an event. The 747 made it normal for Japanese companies to have employees regularly traveling to the United States and Europe, and for American and European tourists to visit Japan in a volume that would have been logistically impossible with earlier aircraft on earlier economics. The specific routes the 747 made possible, and the cities it connected that were not previously connected non-stop, are too numerous to list individually. The aggregate effect of these connections was to make the physical world smaller in the specific sense that matters for human activity, the time required to move between any 2 points on the planet. This shrinkage was not universal. It was concentrated on the routes that the 747 flew, in the economies that had the money to pay for seats, in the commercial and tourism flows that the aircraft's economics made viable at the price points that produced those flows. The 747 did not make the world smaller for everyone, but for the people and economies it served, the world it inhabited was a genuinely, measurably different size than it had been in 1969. By the time Qantas painted its final 747 with the original Longreach and flew it out of Australia for the last time in 2020, the aircraft had been making the world smaller for 50 years, on routes where no substitute had initially existed. What replaced it on those routes was an aircraft that the 747 itself had made commercially possible, by proving that passengers would pay for seats on long-haul non-stop services, and that the demand for those seats would grow rather than diminish. The final variant of the 747 had already been in the sky for nearly a decade by then, trying its best in a market that had decisively moved on. The passenger 747's retirement was not a single event, but a process that unfolded across 2 decades, accelerated by an economic logic that had been building since the 1990s, and then completed in a matter of months by circumstances that no airline had planned for. The logic was this: an aircraft with 4 engines costs more to maintain than an aircraft with 2 engines, when both are capable of flying the same routes to the same destinations. For most of aviation history, the risk profile of flying over large bodies of water with only 2 engines was considered high enough to require 4 engines as a redundancy measure, and the economic penalty of the additional engines was accepted as a necessary cost of operating long-haul routes safely. As jet engines became more reliable, and as the statistical case for their reliability accumulated across decades of operation and millions of flight cycles, the aviation regulatory framework began adjusting its requirements to match the actual risk rather than the theoretical risk. The change that ultimately undermined the four-engine economic case was the expansion of ETOPS, Extended-Range Twin-Engine Operational Performance Standards, the framework governing how far twin-engine commercial aircraft can fly from the nearest suitable diversion airport. In the early 1980s, twin-engine airliners were not permitted to fly routes that took them more than 60 minutes from a diversion airport, which effectively excluded them from the Central Pacific and most of the North Atlantic. As the Airbus A300, the Boeing 767, and later the 777 accumulated reliability records, ETOPS limits were progressively extended to 120 minutes, 180 minutes, and eventually to 330 minutes for the most capable and best documented airframes. By the late 2000s, twin-engine aircraft could legally and routinely fly routes that had once required four engines, and they could do so at operating costs meaningfully lower than any four-engine alternative. The 747 saw its passenger market contract steadily through the 2000s as airlines shifted new orders for wide-body aircraft to twin-engine types. The economic argument for continuing to operate existing 747 fleets remained valid on densely trafficked routes, where the aircraft's high seat count produced load factors that sustained the economics. But the argument for ordering new 747s diminished as alternatives improved. Airlines retired their oldest 747 passenger aircraft and generally chose not to replace them with new ones. Delta Airlines permanently retired its 747 fleet in 2017, becoming one of the first major U.S. carriers to complete the transition. United Airlines followed, retiring its last 747 passenger service in 2018. British Airways continued operating its 747-400 fleet longer than most, maintaining the type as a core element of its Heathrow long-haul operation into 2020. The retirement decisions that had been proceeding gradually came to an abrupt conclusion in March and April of 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic grounded commercial aviation globally. Airlines that had been maintaining aging 747 fleets as part of their revenue operation found, when the pandemic ended, passenger demand almost entirely, that the aircraft they had parked were too expensive to maintain in storage for an uncertain period and too fuel-intensive to operate profitably if passenger demand returned slowly. Decisions that might have been deferred for years were compressed into months. British Airways announced in July 2020 that its entire 747 fleet would not return to service. The announcement was made with specific acknowledgement of what was being retired and what it had meant. The aircraft that had built British Airways' reputation for long-haul service across 3 decades was being retired at once, permanently, 2 decades ahead of the schedule that had been in place at the start of 2020. A farewell flight took place on October 8, 2020, marking the formal end of the type's passenger service with the airline. Qantas flew its last revenue 747 service on July 22, 2020, the aircraft departing in a livery that read the original long reach, acknowledging, in its final hours of service, the role it had played in building the route structure that made Australian long-haul aviation what it became. The aircraft crossed the Pacific and landed in the United States for maintenance, final decommissioning, and storage. By the end of 2020, the global 747 passenger fleet had contracted to a fraction of what it had been at the beginning of that year. Korean Air, Air China, and a small number of charter operators continued flying 747 passenger services, but the great era of the Queen as the defining aircraft of long-haul passenger aviation had concluded within a few months of a global disruption that none of the airlines managing those fleets had anticipated. What remained in the air every night was the freight, and on a production line in Everett, Washington, one final aircraft was being prepared for the delivery ceremony that would close a production run spanning more than 5 decades and 1,574 aircraft, none of which would ever be built again. On January 31, 2023, the 1,574th Boeing 747 ever manufactured was delivered to its customer at Payne Field in Everett, Washington. The aircraft was a 747-8 freighter, registered N863GT, and it was received by Atlas Air, the American cargo airline whose operations had for years been built around the 747's distinctive combination of payload capacity and range. The delivery took place at the same airfield from which the first 747, the city of Everett, had taken its maiden flight on February 9, 1969, 54 years and approximately 340 days earlier. The production line that Sutter's 4,500 engineers had built to fulfill had produced its last aircraft on that airfield, and was now permanently closed. Boeing had affixed to this final aircraft a decal. The decal showed a photograph of Joe Sutter's face, his name, an image of the first 747, and 4 words, "Forever Incredible." The words referred to Sutter's team, the engineers who had built the aircraft that bore their legacy on its fuselage, and by extension to the aircraft itself, which had accumulated 54 years of service and 1,573 predecessors before this final airframe left Everett for the cargo routes it was built to fly. Joe Sutter had not lived to see the end of the program he had started. He died on August 30th, 2016, at a hospital in Bremerton, Washington, from complications of pneumonia at the age of 95. He had worked in aviation for more than 4 decades, spent the years after his 1986 retirement consulting for Boeing, and continued to give interviews about the 747 with a clarity and precision that people who spoke with him in his final years found remarkable in someone of his age. He had served on the Rogers Commission investigating the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, work that reflected both his technical standing and his willingness to apply the same standards of engineering rigor to someone else's program that he had demanded of his own. He was awarded the United States National Medal of Technology in 1985. On his 90th birthday in 2011, Boeing renamed its primary commercial engineering building in Everett the Joe Sutter Building, a designation that made the building the most fitting imaginable monument to someone whose life's work had been conducted in the structures it represented. The team that had built the original 747 had been called the Incredibles for completing something unprecedented in an impossible time frame against severe financial pressure and emerging with an aircraft that worked. The word on the last 747's fuselage was a deliberate echo of that description, chosen by Boeing to close the program in a way that acknowledged what the beginning had been. Forever Incredible was not a marketing phrase. It was a specific reference to a specific group of people who had done a specific thing in 1965 through 1968, and to a program that had sustained that beginning for 54 more years. The Atlas Air crew that accepted delivery of N863GT flew the aircraft directly into commercial service. The last 747 ever built did not go to a museum, did not undergo any ceremonial treatment beyond the delivery ceremony itself, and was not preserved as a demonstration example. It went to work, as cargo 747s do, flying freight on the routes that Atlas Air assigns its aircraft to, carrying packages and pallets and commercial shipments across the oceanic routes that the cargo 747 serves better than any available alternative. The last queen entered service without ceremony beyond the ceremony of her delivery, which is the most appropriate possible ending for an aircraft that spent most of its life simply doing what it was built to do, very reliably, for a very long time. The 1,574 aircraft that Boeing produced between 1968 and 2023 flew approximately 7 billion people over the course of the program's service history, a figure that represents something close to the entire current population of the Earth. Not every person, and not every person once. The calculation is an aggregate of flight hours and passenger counts across all operators and all variants across more than 50 years. But it is the number that results from adding up all the flights, all the seat miles, and all the passengers across the program. and it is the number that best captures what the conversation between Trippe and Allen in 1965 eventually became when translated into the daily operation of an aircraft across the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. What the forever incredible decal on N863 GT's fuselage commemorated was not just a machine, it was the decision to build it, and all the decisions made by 4,500 engineers in the years that followed, and all the people who boarded it for the next 54 years on routes that it made possible, including 2 babies born over Africa and 1,085 others on their way to a new country on a single afternoon in May 1991. The aircraft went to Everett. The program ended. The Queen is still in the air. Stand again at the gate window. Watch the aircraft push back from the terminal, the tug disconnecting, the engines starting one by one in their pods beneath the wings. The tail is 6 stories tall. The body is longer than the Wright brothers ever flew. The wingspan is wider than the flight that proved human flight was possible. Nothing this large should be able to leave the ground, and yet it has been leaving the ground, on runways across the world, for more than 50 years. This is what the full story looks like, assembled. In 1965, a man who ran an airline and a man who ran an aircraft company had a conversation at a fishing lodge in the Pacific Northwest, and between them agreed to build something that had never been built before, without a design, without a factory, without an engineer assigned to the program. The aircraft they agreed to build would have to be 2.5 times the size of anything currently flying commercially, designed, manufactured, and ready for delivery within 5 years, funded almost entirely by a company that very nearly went bankrupt in the process. The engineer assigned to lead this effort, Joe Sutter, assembled 4,500 people to work on it. He calculated precisely where on the runway the finished aircraft would lift off from its first flight. When the first 747 took off from Payne Field on February 9, 1969, it lifted off at exactly that spot. Sutter had known where it was going to leave the ground before the aircraft had been fully assembled. 6 months later, the aircraft appeared at the Paris Air Show, an event at which the world of aviation gathered to look at it with the particular mixture of admiration and disbelief that things of extraordinary size tend to produce. 6 months after that, it received its airworthiness certificate. 1 month after that, a substitute aircraft, 6 hours late, departed New York for London, with 335 passengers aboard, and a new era of commercial aviation began. In the years that followed, an airline named Qantas used this aircraft to open Australia to the world, and installed a bar in its upper deck with a wooden ship's wheel and ocean charts on the walls. Pan Am served first-class passengers roast beef carved tableside above the Atlantic. American carriers put pianists in the rear lounges of coach cabins so that passengers who had paid economy fares could drink and listen to live music at 35,000 feet. A 30% share of Pan Am's first-class passengers chose that airline specifically because of what they found at the top of a spiral staircase. A version of this aircraft, with its nose designed to open, became the dominant instrument of global air freight, still flying tonight. 2 versions of it, with tail numbers 28,000 and 29,000, carry the President of the United States and form the airborne command structure of the most powerful government on Earth. 2 versions, with attachment points above their fuselages, carried every space shuttle orbiter ever built from the landing strips where they came down to the launch pads where they went up. A version fitted with a 2.7-meter telescope in its rear fuselage observed the universe from above most of the Earth's atmosphere. On May 24, 1991, one aircraft of this type carried 1,087 people from Addis Ababa to Tel Aviv, 2 of whom were born during the flight. The number remains a world record. On January 31, 2023, the 1,574th aircraft of this type was delivered at Payne Field in Everett, Washington. the same airfield where the first one had flown. The aircraft bore a decal with a photograph of Joe Sutter and 4 words, "Forever Incredible." The aircraft went to work the next day. Tonight, somewhere in the dark above an ocean, a 747 is carrying freight from one continent to another. 2 aircraft, designated 28,000 and 29,000, are on the ground at Joint Base Andrews, waiting. The aircraft that carried the space shuttle on its back is now at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia, where visitors can walk beneath it and look up at the mounting hardware that held an orbiter in place above its fuselage. The last spiral staircase is in a photograph. The piano is in someone's memory. The roast beef trolley is somewhere in the past. The Queen is still in the air. If tonight's long, unhurried journey through the history of the most remarkable commercial aircraft ever built has settled you somewhere quiet and ready for rest, this channel will be here on whatever night you need it. More stories, more aircraft, more of the patient and extraordinary things that human beings build and fly. Come back whenever you are ready. The engines are still running. The sky is still very large. There is no hurry at all. My dear sleep science lovers, could you please say in the comments where you're watching from right now? Also, good news. Simple Sleepy Science episodes are now available for free on Spotify. Use the link in the description or on the channel profile to enjoy our stories there.